Satellite Haiku. Yeah, intros.
All right.
Yeah.
I'm Shawn.
I'm MiLo.
And this is Satellite Haiku.
Satellite Haiku. And we were going to talk about Satellite Haiku, the name.
Yeah, let's talk about the name.
My initial thought, I forget, were you talking about satellite? And I said, I love that we are two satellites making observations as we circle the Earth in our orbits. It's like two orbits, two satellites, two sets of sensors, observing what we see at a high level. And then when we were trying to come up with the name, I said, we're not just that, we're processing and we're coming up with synthesizing, right?
That's exactly right. Yeah, I think, I don't know why satellite popped into my head. I like the word itself, it. And then the image of just, on this, you had mentioned the kind of the idea of a journey, like being on a journey, gathering information, and then, and somehow satellite came to me as one of these images that could kind of evoke that journey idea and the gathering of information. Then you said two satellites, which I love that image. This is a little bit of a digression, but what I've always been really fascinated with is Laika, the Russian dog that went into space. I don't know. I love that name for some reason. And then there was a band called Laika. And so this dog in space looking down on the world always kind of.
Was it spelled like the camera company, or is it?
No, it's L-A-I.
Oh, L-A-I-K-A.
Yeah.
Oh, wow, that's so cool.
And anyway, that's a little bit of a digression. So we came up with satellite, but then I think we were talking about, or you raised the idea that, well, we're not just gathering information. There's like a synthesis, a distillation. We need to come up with something that we process that information into something. And we try to come to some sort of insight or conclusion. So, yeah. And then haiku just popped into my head. Satellite haiku. I sort of felt like it just, the syllables felt good in my mouth almost. And then you had this really nice reference to haiku in your life with your girls. What was that? After we reached a certain point where we agreed that presents were kind of silly, like on birthdays, because if you needed something, you just bought it, right? So we didn't need more stuff. So he said, what should we do? And I said, let's write each other a haiku. And I think what's wonderful for our name is that when you sit down you only get 5 syllables, 7 and 5. And so you have to you have to take this bigger message and distill it down into this very sutra-like, packetized, very dense thing. And that's kind of what it feels like we're doing anyway. So did you each write everybody else one, or did each of you write one person a haiku?
If it was the birthday person, then they received haikus from each of the other members of the group.
Got it. For birthday, that makes sense. Yeah, of course.
Yeah. And it's always
I was thinking Christmas, or like we were all exchanging, but no, birthdays is what you said. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think there's a mental exercise because they often, I've never studied haikus like classically, but I'm sure that there is you need to set a sense of, they're like little films. They're like little, right? Like you set a sense of place, like snow on white cedars, immediately you're in this place, and then it's like something happens, and then you come up with a conclusion. There's something else, and then the third thing is what comes from those two things, which is exactly, I feel like, what we were describing in this process. Yeah.
Did you watch the Shogun miniseries, the recent one on Hulu?
Yeah. Wow.
Oh, so incredible. I don't know why the poetry made me think of that, because remember they would do these, they would play almost this game or this ritual of creating poetry. Somebody would have what was her name? Mariko? She had the first line. She would say the first line, and then somebody else had to write the rest of the poem, or they would have this sort of ritual where they wrote these poems together. They were probably haiku or some early form that, anyway, such a gorgeous series though. Amazing.
And, so because I dove back into filmmaking and cinematography. And so I'm looking at it and I'm Googling what lenses did they use? And they use these really old anamorphic lenses that are blurry and distorted on the sides. And they have and they just were we're going to use these because it works with the subject matter. It works with the very low lighting. There's almost no cinematic lighting. They used a lot of open windows and doors and just absolutely stunningly beautiful cinematography. That's what I came away with.
Oh yeah.
As well as the acting too.
It's funny because yeah, I mean that's such a you thing to get really notice and see in a production like that, like, and then to think about like how do they produce that look. Yeah, it's funny. I don't think about that at all, but I always appreciate that's your sort of one of the things that you notice. Yeah.
And if you dive into the Reddit forums, like the cinematography ones, people are like, it's disgusting. What producer let them use those lenses? Everything looks like it's shot through a Coke bottle. Like other people are like, it's genius. It's genius. No, we've never seen television like this,
Yeah. I love the idea that you're even on those Reddits. That's awesome.
It is funny how, and everyone has like their own sort of perspective and their own kind of like preference, I guess.
I wanted to just check in on other like random stuff first. Like, have you been watching? I mean, we talked about the election last time, but have you been following news at all?
I've kind of cut myself down, weaned myself down to like maybe 10 or 7% of what I was.
Yeah.
And I'm just kind of rolling my eyes and thinking it's like the clown car show. Like, remember last time, so Huli works, my wife works as an environmental scientist, and she does a lot of work under grants that are the Department of Energy.
Mm-hmm.
So if it's like agricultural, it's actually Department of Energy because of.
Was that the Oops one? Was Energy the Oops one from Rick Perry?
Yeah, exactly. No. So then they were like, which departments are you going to get rid of? And he was like, education, transportation, and I can't remember. And then Tom thought it would be funny to just appoint him to that department because like it's just
that's the one he wanted to get rid of. But he couldn't remember.
We couldn't even remember it because he's just such a dumbass. And the thing is that he won like Dancing with the Stars. Like he was the governor of Texas and he won Dancing with the Stars. Like, like that's
wow.
Yeah. So, I mean, so the cool thing about it was Trump thinks, let's punk them and put him in charge of this department because he's such a dumbass, right? He walks in, the guy that was his predecessor had 2 PhDs.
Mm.
And he walked in, and luckily, I mean, this is coming from.
I remember that guy. Yeah.
Louis said he walked in and he was like, dude, you guys, I'm way over my head. Just tell me what you need. And he was actually kind of a good secretary because he didn't disrupt what they were doing. He just, he subordinated himself to their needs, and it ended up being fine. Now, I think what might happen with some of these other ones, like Matt Gaetz being in charge of.
I don't think he'll get confirmed.
I don't think he'll be confirmed either, but he could, And
he could. I haven't been watching. I mean, just to the question of watching the news, I've never been a big news watcher, but I'm the same as you. I dialed it way down. Like I was going to say it's a slow moving train wreck, but it doesn't feel that slow moving. So I just can't. I kind of just can't like. And it's interesting. There's a lot of the sentiment that I've seen over the last few weeks. There's a sort of like there's a contingent of sort of it's your movement now, guys. Like we tried, there's a little bit of like that. I don't know how I feel about that, to be honest, but I do get the sentiment. I get that sentiment, like.
Here's a very practical question that is spinning around. For our 401ks, when do we cash out? Like, when do we?
Oh yeah, because the stock market's like way up right now.
Yeah, like historic high.
Like going gangbusters. Yeah.
And it's possible that when the 20% tariffs hit, like there will come a crash. How do we avoid the crash? That's what I want to. I mean, Warren Buffett sold like $42 billion worth of Apple stock, and he's like cashing out, and he doesn't cash out. So
right. Yeah.
I'm not like a big investor dude, but I do want to keep my eye on. I don't want to like,
Yeah, we're a little old. We need our, we need our retirement money. Our kids need a little something when we die. Right. Don't want to lose it all.
Totally. Or we're not losing it all, but actually it's the pain of the pandemic and Putin's war.
Yeah.
Created this sense that like you just had to wait and wait for it to come back up. And I hated that. I hated feeling trapped and not being able to. Anyway. But so that was a practical question. When do we cash out? That's not really the topic of our podcast. So
No.
is how and when to invest during tumultuous times.
Yeah. I can tell like it's stressing me out a little bit though, because I have this like psoriasis thing that sometimes flares up a little. I get these little itchy rashes, and I sometimes don't always notice the kind of the psychological stress, but it'll manifest physically like that. And yeah. So I can tell that it's stressing me out, or something's stressing me out a little bit. Maybe it's not that, but I can tell that I have some sort of lingering or low level anxiety that's causing this rash to break out a little bit. Yeah. If I appear here with like a whole rash on my face, like one of these weeks, you know that I'm really stressed out. After
I think it was COVID, but my eczema came back. I'm 55, and I had it as a child. Like I was allergic to eggs and weed, and I had like nasty, bleeding sores on my face.
Yeah.
And then I got it on my eyelid. I was working out, and the sweat was stinging like crazy, and I had it on my forehead. And I went to my skin doctor, and she goes, "Did you have eczema as a kid?" And I was like, "Yeah." And she goes, "Well, it comes back. I mean, this is eczema." And it turns out I'm allergic to oats.
Oats?
Oats. And oats, they put like colloidal oats in skincare products to soothe people's skin.
Right.
Yeah. And like when I had chickenpox when I was 20, they put me in a colloidal oat bath, and I started screaming. Like it would hurt. It stung so much. And they were like, weird, just rinse them off, And it turns out like I'm allergic to oats, and other people use it to help their skin. And it makes my skin like I don't know what the verb of eczema is, but it makes it.
I wonder how common that is. Like that's because you're right. They use colloidal oats in lotion and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Like when I was leaving the office during that appointment, she handed me like a sample, and then I said, "Do I have to check everything for oats?" And she goes, "Yeah, let's look." And she goes, "Oh, it has colloidal oat." Like every skincare product is, because it soothes most people's skin.
Yeah.
But for me, it gives me eczema, which is pretty nasty. And so I've been kind of battling with that. And I think that it came back maybe from the stress of the pandemic, but maybe also just from the COVID tended to cause autoimmune things to sort of flare.
Yeah.
So people were getting like shingles and things like that, things where your immune system is like.
I mean, I think that's when this psoriasis kind of came back for me. It was right at the beginning of the pandemic. I think it was the same thing. I was also super stressed out in my job at the time. Like I had this job that was totally crushing, and that plus the pandemic, trying to have kids at home doing school, like Zoom kindergarten was hell. Like I wouldn't wish Zoom kindergarten on anybody. So my daughter was starting kindergarten. She had all these new classmates, that she'd never met. She had teachers she'd never seen, right? She'd never seen these people. So she's trying, and she's whatever you are in kindergarten, 5 years old, 6 years old, trying to do Zoom calls with a bunch of strangers. Like it was ridiculous. And there was this other kid on the call every time. I won't say his name, but like, the teachers, they were they did a heroic job. Like it sucked for them, I'm sure. But it would be constantly like, "Hey, so-and-so, turn your, mute yourself, can you mute yourself?" And then it'll be so-and-so, come back, get out from under your desk. Just like the teachers trying to wrangle these kids on Zoom. And Dylan, or my son, was in his room, it just closed in. He was on Zoom calls too for school. And we just had to ignore him and just kind of hope he was doing fine, because my daughter took so much attention from us that, my son would be in his room in third grade with his door closed, and, they would even do Zoom PE. I'd hear him jumping around in there.
Wow. It was so wild. It's like growing up on the space station or something or something.
Yeah.
It's so weird.
But luckily he did fine. He was, I heard stories of some of his classmates that were just watching YouTube videos all day, and not actually paying attention to but my son, he's a rule follower. He did fine.
Oh, that's pretty funny. I was on a call. I got really sick of doing Zoom calls at work, and we were doing them a lot because the company I was with was international. So there'd be like people in California and Switzerland. And so we often did Zoom calls before the pandemic. But once the pandemic hit, and we were just nonstop on these calls, like 8 of them a day, And everyone always just mashes away and does the 1 hour, if they need 20 minutes. I started to ask, like, can we by default start with 15 minutes? And then if you really need half an hour, go, and then if you really need an hour, like book it in advance. Like don't just, because people always just took 1 hour. Anyway, so I'm on there and there's probably our team was maybe 20 people or something, 15, 20 people. And I was playing with this, I was building this, like a 4x5, how you can tilt shift camera. Like it had a lens on the front that was like a Soviet era medium format lens. And then I had bought this Japanese rail system for macro stuff. And then you could tilt the front up and down, left and right, and you could mount the camera on the back. So I would work on it while we were on the calls, and I'd, turn off my camera. And at one point I started getting these hangs from one of my coworkers or one of the women on the agency we were on the call with. And she was like, Milo, we can all see the camera. Cause I was looking at us through the camera. And so then I quickly put it away and apologized. But it was I was just like those kids, who are.
There were stories of people doing really embarrassing things, accidentally on camera during that whole period.
Totally, yeah.
Yeah. It was brutal. I mean, because you have these all day, back-to-back meetings, but even when you're working at an office, you would at least sometimes walk from one conference room to another. But on these days, I remember it was just you're just sitting at this one chair in front of this camera, okay, now to the next meeting, It got pretty brutal there for me. But
it really did. I wanted to go back to something we were talking about with the stress, possibly when you're under stress from uncertainty, like COVID or something. Mm-hmm. So if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs and you roll the clock back to when we were primordial people, our daily acquisition of protein and carbohydrates was such a serious concern that we worried about it, every day pretty much. We woke up thinking, where am I going to get my next carbohydrate protein intake, right? As we became an industrialized society, as we invented agriculture and became more, division of labor, those things, those essential things moved further and further out of our sort of scope, out of the things we needed to worry about. It was I worry about doing a good job at work so that I can earn money to buy the food that someone else made. You know what I mean? I don't have to worry. I don't think so much about acquiring the food, right? So I feel there's, in the back of our minds, when there's wars on the world stage, when there are pandemics that affect everyone globally, and then when you have this, there's potential for a government disruption or a governmental disruption that could cause tremendous strife in the economy. And we're buffered by the fact that we have savings, we have stocks we could sell, we own, our houses, but we know that in general, if the stock market crashed and people were laid off, there could be more violence in the streets, there could be more crime, we might not be able to get all the food we need. And I feel that I often use the analogy of you're walking at night to your car in the Walmart parking lot, and there's a sodium vapor lamp that has a bad ballast, and it's going, and all that noise, it's not producing any light, it's just wasting energy because it's vibrating. And that's to me what my fight or flight mechanism is doing under these conditions. It's always in the background, and I'm losing energy. I'm putting cortisol into my bloodstream that I don't need. I'm putting adrenaline in that I don't really need because I'm not under attack. But in the back of my mind, I'm worried about the future. Going
right. On. Just like your caveman brain is taking in all of this information about kind of war and conflict and potential looming, want or need or looming crises of some sort, right? And so that's what you mean, right? You're kind of on some level, you're picking that up. You might not even be thinking about it or aware of it, but on some level, you're tuning into it, like that sodium lamp or whatever, like that.
Yeah, it's to me that the lamp represents the wasted energy of worrying about something of which you have power over. Like we voted and we knocked on doors, but we don't have any power over what will happen with the new administration that we don't agree with their policies. So that I think is an interesting thing to look into. How do we kind of come to terms with and reduce the amount of wasted energy and you mentioned like not really being like looking at the news,
Mhm.
you know, and one of my friends said, I'm not going to look at the news for 4 years from 2016 to 2020. And then they constantly would say to me, what's happening? Is there any gossip? Like, can you tell me, you know, like what's going on? Like they wanted to know, you know, because they were,
Yeah.
but, and I'm not sure that that's the right answer either. I do think that, just like all of the information we consume through our social media, through our phones, whatever devices we have, even through, you know, gossiping with neighbors, we need to obviously find a way to balance that out with mindful things, with things like making bread, cooking at home. You know what I mean? Like I think going on a walk when we exercising.
Absolutely. Yeah. Today's my bread making day, by the way, every week.
Nice. Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. I mean, I bake it tomorrow, but I make the dough today. Yeah.
Nice. So you feed it, you feed the starter.
I make my leaven today and my starter and make the dough. And then I proof it overnight and
do you proof it in the fridge?
Yeah. Overnight. Yeah. Because my wife, she tends to work at the office during the week. And so I was baking bread, and then it was just me at home with this whole loaf of bread when it was like the best fresh bread. And so I've shifted to like, I have a nice loaf for the weekend so everybody can have it. Yeah.
That's good.
Otherwise I'm just chowing down on a whole loaf of bread.
Yeah. I had to, because with the tartine recipe, you always make two, right? Two loaves.
I just make one.
Oh, you do? You make 500
grams. Half the recipe.
Yeah. I was making two, and my wife convinced me that I had to give one away.
Oh yeah, that's
a cool thing because you know it's not that. But
do you have two proofing baskets though? I don't. That's the only reason I don't do two. I don't have two baskets.
That purpose, yeah. I actually had a round one and a long one, and I didn't really like that, so I ended up doing two long ones, which doesn't quite fit under the crock pot thing. Like sometimes it touches the end and you get a little black thing on the end because it's just that long, you know. I kind of need a longer. What do they? Dutch oven.
Yeah.
Do you use the Dutch oven? That's the method. Yeah.
I use like an old Le Creuset, kind of the round one. Yeah.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
So I guess we should probably get to. We had raised a couple possibilities to dive into a little bit. One was loneliness.
Oh yeah.
And the other was that just the what AI will do. That one article that Ted Chiang wrote in the New Yorker and kind of. But yeah, what did you want to what do you want to dive into?
Well, in general, you know, we have been talking for the past couple of weeks about what our podcast is about and what our conversations have been about. You know, and how it's been such a long thread. And I feel like one of the things that happened to me during the pandemic is, even though I had extra time, like, you know, I wasn't commuting, so I had this like extra time to do things. I felt like the lowest urge, even to reach out to old friends and contact them. It felt like there was some kind of an emotional or psychic lift to open up that, and I felt like more like I was collapsing inward and just becoming more and more insular.
And was it just you and your wife at home?
No, actually, at the beginning, I had my brother-in-law and my sister-in-law. So my wife's brother and his wife got stuck here. They were visiting from Colombia in Chicago. Literally came to our house right when the whole place shut down. So they were stuck here for like 4 months. So we were all kind of crammed into our little house, 1,300 square foot house. My sister-in-law got pregnant.
Wow.
I mean, that's why she was having trouble getting pregnant. So her doctor said, go on a sabbatical, tour the United States, take some months off. And then so she got pregnant in Tucson. But then, you know, trying to get prenatal care at the beginning of the pandemic was a disaster. I mean, we would call all these places and they're like, nah, labs are closed. The offices, we have no idea when we're going to open. We don't, you know, we'd call Planned Parenthood and they'd be like, well, we don't really know what to tell you, you know.
Oh my God.
It was super scary, right?
But you were saying that, so you just were in this phase where you felt like you were fine not talking to anybody. In fact, more comfortable kind of not to catch up. I was too, by the way, but keep going with that.
Yeah, no. So, so that's where it began for me. And I found that ironic. Like I found like, when I used to commute, I would call people on the phone and I had like a 45-minute commute. So I had like nice blocks of time to just catch up with people. And ironically, not commuting and having that extra time, I felt less inclined or even almost like had an aversion. It's more once I started, like when we talked once or twice, we talked a few times. Once I actually got on the phone with someone, it was great. But it was that making that leap to make the connection became increasingly hard. Yeah.
I had the same thing. I think you and I didn't talk much during that whole time. I mean, it might've been, so we talk a lot now. But during that time, I think we probably went 6 months or more without talking. Each time we would talk, then 6 more months would go by. The reason I asked whether you were home alone or with your wife or who was there, because I remember having this moment where I felt like I wasn't catching up with anybody. I wasn't interested in talking to anybody. I made no calls to old friends, any of that, just like you're saying. And I remember sort of asking myself or trying to sort of inquire into myself, what's wrong with me? Like, why? And so I think the excuse I landed on was, well, I'm here with my wife and my kids and we're all stuck in the house and I'm really craving like any moment of solitude that I get. And so I don't want to interrupt that solitude with a phone call to somebody. And I don't know if that was it, if that was the right thing, but I remember sort of that's how I explained it to myself, that I just don't feel like talking to anybody because I'm home all day with these people all the time. Right. People that I love, but I just like, I get really kind of crazy if I don't have some solitude.
Yeah. No, that's true for me too. And like the way I would survive a work day is at lunch, I started going on a 4-mile run in the desert. Like my office was in the desert and there was a track that once you turned the corner, you couldn't see buildings or cars. It was just desert, like hills with cactus and stuff. So if I didn't get that, if someone booked a meeting on my lunch run, I got really grumpy, because I really needed that time where no one was talking to me and I would just talk to myself, listen to things. So you're right. Maybe that's partly what it was. The other thing for me that I didn't like was I felt like I was treading water and like I wasn't doing anything interesting or making any progress. So I didn't want like, when you go to like the idea of like going to your high school reunion, there's this kind of uncomfortable thing of like people checking up on you after 10 years. Like, what have you done with these 10 years? And if you're not like, if you haven't done everything you wanted and you're not super proud of it, you kind of do this personal inventory when you're like, So I felt like it was super hyper intense that it's like, well, what did you do? I did bake bread.
Yeah.
I got in a bunch of Zoom calls and then we're working on the stucco, like on our house. It has cracks, like that's about it.
What do I have to say? Yeah, I remember that exact feeling as well. I think that was the other thing I was going to say the same thing is that I think the other thing was exactly that. Like you're not taking in any new information. I'm like on my work calls with my people all day long. And then I'm here sitting with my family trying to sort of decompress at the end of the day, doing normal, boring family stuff. There's nothing, if I call you, what am I going to talk about? Which is ridiculous because you and I have never suffered from a lack of things to talk about. In fact, my wife always laughs because when I call you, she will ask me for those basic, boring family updates about you. And I don't know the answers because we never talk about that, right? We immediately start talking about which camera they might have used on, Shogun or something, right? Like and then that leads to some other random thing. But anyway, so let's bring it back to loneliness. Like, so how does that sort of tap into that topic for you?
Well, yeah. So I felt like my relationship with solitude, and I'm going to use the term solitude loosely because I kind of want to define it. I had heard someone say years ago that that you can convert loneliness into solitude by sort of meditating and realizing that you're in the presence of a divine, you could say God or some other, like a higher power, right? And if you're able to quiet down and be aware of that there's more than just you as a singular point, then your loneliness, which is an uncomfortable experience, becomes solitude, which is a very profound, profound experience. You could almost say like a spiritual experience, right? And that in order to make that conversion, to go from being uncomfortable, you had to shift your mindset.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a practice, and that you could practice that in yoga, you could practice that in meditation. But it's really like, instead of seeing the experience as one of being a victim of being alone, as you said before, like you really had a need to be alone, and so there's this finding the joy in being alone and being happy being alone. And that, so my relationship changed where I became increasingly fine being alone.
Mm.
You know what I mean? And I'm an extrovert, I would say. I need that, my lunch run, but if I get that, I can just, and so, yeah, I guess that was odd for me. And it was scary because it felt like I might end up like just this, when I was growing up, there was this mean old man that lived like 4 houses away down the hill. And like when our ball would roll into his yard, like he would come out and pick it up and go like, and then he'd like walk into the house and we were like, ugh. Like we hated that guy because he didn't like.
It's like every movie that has kids as the main characters.
He didn't give out Halloween candy. We kind of admired him at first because we heard that he was a railroad conductor, not a conductor, like a train operator, like an engine driver, on a train. And he did wear like a little cap, but he was just super mean to all the kids in the neighborhood. And if like he didn't want us to have any fun, if we made too much noise, he would come out and yell at us, So I was like, am I going to turn into that guy? Like I'm just going to become increasingly insular until like little kids running around and I shout at them,
Yeah.
So that was really my sort of, I guess, my fear as the pandemic progressed.
Because you are as you said, you're an extroverted person naturally. I don't think you're an extreme extrovert. I mean, like you say, you like that solitude of a run and stuff. So you're not, but I've always known you as somebody who's an extrovert, who's excited to go to places where you're going to meet people and like that energizes you, right?
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
I'm definitely pretty far on the introvert side, and so I love solitude, and I, thinking about the difference between solitude and loneliness is a super interesting question for me, because I almost can never get enough solitude. One time my wife asked me, she's also pretty introverted, but I'm more so than her. And she said, if I and the kids were to leave the house for some indefinite period of time, how long would it take you to start wanting to call people to hang out? Like, how long would you just be by yourself? And I said, I think probably 3 months, 4 months, maybe. And she was just like stunned. She was expecting like days, or maybe weeks. But when I went right to months, she just couldn't believe it. And I don't know if that's really true. I mean, I think the conversation happened in a place where I definitely wasn't getting enough solitude. So I was kind of stressed out by it. And we were having little fights sometimes about me needing my Shawn time. But yeah, I mean, loneliness is interesting because when I think about loneliness, it's almost a totally different category. Like I can feel really lonely in a room full of people. Like,
yeah.
And I think loneliness is like a psychological distance from other people for me. And it's not about physical distance. It's not about physical solitude. It's about psychological, like some sort of psychological block or some psychological distance that prevents me from being with people or feeling like I'm with people. I don't know. I mean, there have been times when I was both lonely and solitary. I remember my first Christmas in Tucson, or first Christmas in Arizona, I guess. I was living in Tempe at the time. And it was my first, I didn't have money to fly home. I didn't want to drive. I had driven across the country so many times at that point. I just didn't have it in me to drive all the way to the East Coast for Christmas. So I remember thinking, oh, this will be fine. I'll just go camping by myself, winter camping. And I went down to the Chiricahua Mountains, and there was something about the fact that it was Christmas and there's nobody on the roads. It made me feel so lonely. Like Christmas you spend with people. And even though I love being outside in nature and camping and being by myself, I remember hiking into the Chiricahuas, and that, and it's winter, right? So then the sun goes down at 5 o'clock or some crazy thing. So then it was dark and I'm not nearly tired yet, right? So I have a campfire going and I'm trying to keep it going a little bit to keep myself warm. And it got really cold as soon as the sun went down. And then it's 5:30 and I'm not tired at all, but I'm thinking, what do I do in the dark here in my campsite all by? Oh man, it was one of the longest nights I remember of my whole life, feeling so lonely and solitary. But that's not typically what loneliness is for me.
Did you have Larry with you, your dog?
Not at that point. I didn't have Larry yet. Yeah.
I remember being impressed that you would go camping by yourself without Larry, and I was like, wow, I've never done that actually. Never.
It definitely there was in fact there was never, and it never had no fear. And I remember so I was totally heartbroken in Tempe, and I remember feeling like, oh, what am I doing here? And this guy I worked with was like this grizzled old backpacker outdoorsman guy, hippie, long hair, just the definition of grizzled. He's, exactly the image you have when you think of that word. And he said, you need to go out into nature. And I had moved from the city of New York, right? So I liked nature, but my experience of nature wasn't like wilderness nature really. And so he convinced me to go. And I had never, I went on a very easy backpack all by myself where he sent me because I was fearful and I had inexperienced and I didn't have many friends there yet. And so for this first weekend, I didn't find anybody who was able to go. And so, yeah, I dove right into it, sort of cold turkey. And I was super scared. I barely slept. But as I got a little more into it, the same guy, he was sort of quizzed me about where I went, and he would catch up with me about it. And one of the questions he asked me, some weeks after I'd started doing this a few times on weekends, and he said, he heard me talk about my tent. And he's like, why are you bringing a tent? This is Arizona. You don't need a tent. It never rains. Tents are for rain, right? And then I started camping without a tent, and that was definitely scary. But in Arizona, where you have the clear skies and the dark skies and the stars, oh man, it's also incredible.
And I'll argue that not so much rain, but the dew, like dew falling in Pennsylvania, like that's when in the morning you wake up with the dew, whereas in Arizona, it's bone dry,
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Now, if I went up to like Prescott area and things like that, it could get a little colder and you do have that morning condensation. But yeah, I remember being woken up there by a herd of elk one time. And they were almost walking through my campsite. It was kind of cool.
Wow. It's pretty wild. So but for loneliness, like I feel like in some ways there's an opportunity to segue into the idea that we had talked about art and AI as a topic, and I wanted to say that when we a year and a half ago when like ChatGPT was launched and you had Midjourney and all these AI kind of like startups began selling their product, but before that, we did have algorithms that were managing the content that we would see based on our sort of preferences or our past behavior on social media platforms. And in some ways, having that early artificial intelligence or that early machine learned something to show us the next thing, like the YouTube algorithm, the idea was to keep us, find the thing that would keep us watching longer. That was the whole point of that. Like if you were to write like the root DNA, like the core part of the chromosome was like, keep them watching on this channel longer. and whatever it takes, like, find something that will spark their interest or find something that makes them argue, whatever that was.
Yeah, pretty soon it was mostly that latter thing. Let's find things that outrage people that keeps them here. Yeah. But anyway.
Yeah, sure. Sure. And I don't really, I'm not really susceptible to that. Like, I don't argue online. I don't argue with people. So for me, it's more like, what's this new, and I have such varied interests that they sometimes just, when I like don't log into YouTube, it's so funny what they pitch, because they just start with this, they just start throwing like lawn chairs and how to fix make a smokeless, fire pit, and like all this weird shit that like they're just trying to see what you click on next, because they have no clue.
Doesn't know you at all.
Yeah, so they start out with this crazy wide thing. Anyway, so I sometimes do that, like on my devices, I do or don't log in just to see what's different about it. And it's pretty interesting. But I think that in some ways you could point to as the rise of the smartphone and those algorithms started to steal away attention from personal interactions and bring, you know what I mean? Even if you think of like they said, remember in the days in the 80s when you would see someone who had one of those big cell phones that had like a case, like a weird, and that person was like the oddball. And if they were having a conversation in the park or at a wharf, at a lake or something, you'd be like, oh, that's weird, And now it's like, since everyone is interacting through text or something, their attention is focused on somewhere else. Like
they're scrolling all the time. Yeah.
Yeah. Or even if they're interacting with another person, that person isn't there.
Right.
Right. And I've actually seen studies that show that when you're sitting next to two people having a dialogue, a conversation, and they're next to you, your brain is super adept at filtering it out because you hear them go back and forth. And the most distracting thing is when you only hear half of the conversation.
Oh, so you mean when you're a bystander?
You're a bystander and there's someone talking on a device, your brain starts to make up what you think the other person is saying, and it's really distracting. It will knock you off, your attention will be lost because your brain just naturally is like wondering, well, what did they say? What could they have said?
I mean, that was I remember a lot of discourse around that when cell phones were first like a big thing, but flip phones, right? Like it was before the time where people were on their phones doing other things. Like if you were on your phone, you were talking to somebody. And so, I totally remember lots of people complaining about like, the experience of being on a bus and having a loud cell phone talker somewhere on the bus with you, right? Because you can't, like you say, you can't ignore it. There's something about the way that works that makes it impossible to ignore it. What's funny is that nobody talks on their phone, on cell phone so much
anymore, right? Yeah, no, not at all.
Like
right?
The phone is just one app that is like a barely used app on this device. We still call the device a phone, but the phone really is just that one app.
Totally. Yeah, someone pointed out when the iPhone 1 came out, they said, it might have been you actually. They said, it's funny because we've converged all these different devices into one device. We're willing to accept the fact that the phone is lower quality than the wired phone. Like it drops in and out and like you can hear, you know what I mean? Like we're willing to be like, oh, it's so convenient that it's portable that we'll discount the fact that it sucks. Like it actually kind of sucks as a phone. Yeah. It's not better than the wired one was, but you can, so I think that was you that pointed out that you're like, weird, like Steve Jobs found a way to make us accept a phone that's not better, like just because it's like
totally. It's funny when Gen X not Gen X, when Gen Z people talk about the phone, like it's a totally different kind of entity in their lives, and like the idea of calling somebody is just almost bizarre. Like, if you are, Gen Z and you're messaging somebody and on a dating app or something, and then you exchange phone numbers and then you start texting. If the person calls, that's like, what's happening? I don't understand what's happening. Like they're calling me. What do I do?
But I wonder if so my whole point is to bring it back around is that I feel like there's roots or seeds to loneliness that have been amplified as we progress in terms of the devices become more complex, and they're more integrated in our daily lives. We kind of never are without our phone.
Yeah.
And then the algorithms are really not there to promote social interaction. They're there to steal our attention away from what would have been personal interactions. I think that's part of it. I don't know that that's...
No, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, and I do wonder, like, with the next generation of kids, like, you know, my son who's just got his first phone, right? And he messages his friends, like, you know, of course, it's not replaced in person to the degree that like you're talking about, you know, as people get older and we have jobs and stuff, and so much of our interaction is on the phone. But I do wonder, like, will it be different with the generation that grows up with it? Like, and it could be different in a couple of different ways. One is a phone could be just not that big a deal and not take over their whole mind like it does with us, because, you know, we get addicted to it. It's partly because it's novel. But the other thing that might be different is that maybe they adjust to digital interaction in a way that feels as sort of real and authentic. Like the way you're talking about it is it's sort of replaced in person, and it's something inferior to an in-person interaction, right? And I wonder if a generation that grows up doing that way more from a much earlier age, if that lack of authenticity, or that what you're kind of identifying as there's sort of this gap between virtual and in person, or digital and in person, I wonder if that gap won't be there as much for somebody who's grown up with it. But I, you know, just to, like, one of the things that in my neighborhood here, we have this great block of people that know each other and stuff, right? And I remember when my wife was pregnant, and we were, you know, with just like, when you have little things you're kind of trying to figure out with a new baby, you know, new parents, and there's just you're like, you know, this problem is a problem that a million parents have solved, right? And so I remember going on YouTube a bunch of times and trying to, you know, oh, how do I clean this thing? Or how do I do this? Or what does it mean when my kid's doing this, or whatever, right? Like all those little things. And YouTube was a huge resource at the time. And I remember having that thought, just like you say, like, man, in an earlier age, I would have asked my neighbors. Like, there's mothers and fathers here on the block who have little kids or a little older than mine. Like, we're neighbors, we're a community. Like, that's where you go for information. And it was a little interesting that even in my own house, when I have all these people like next door, still it's like, oh, well, it's on YouTube, I'll just go on YouTube. So I think it's not only replaced like friendship, in-person conversations in a lot of ways, it displaced that and disrupted that. There's a kind of community energy that I wonder how much of that has been lost in the era of cell phones and digital, you know, the internet, YouTube, all that stuff, like even with strangers.
You know, and this is probably more a topic for another time when we do talk about the AI and art. But I think it makes me think of this. Do you remember this? We've talked about this before. Brian Eno in the 90s wrote an essay about this Korg, or some Japanese keyboard manufacturer gave him the prototype of a keyboard, and the marketing message was, this keyboard is capable of making every sound that the human ear can hear. Like, there's no sound that it can't make. That's sort of like the marketing thing. Like, by adjusting parameters, it could make every sound you could possibly
imagine.
Yeah. So he gets this keyboard and he starts playing around with it, and he writes this essay that I always found really poignant and beautiful. And he said, given a tool, like I grew up playing the violin, and the violin has multiple layers of limits. Like, you can't really hold more than a certain number. You can't play a certain number of strings, maybe 2 at once, right? Or you can finger four at once, you know. But you can't, and it can only go so high, it can only go so low, and then within those limits, you have to figure out how to make it sound beautiful. And it's the human being pushing up against those limits of that device that squeezes out this beautiful art, right? He goes, now I'm sitting in front of this device that literally is an infinite violin. It can do anything.
Mhm.
My job becomes now reductive. Like, what do I not want it to do?
Yeah.
Like, I have to decide. And I actually think when we look at this is more in a general way, like information availability, like our kids grew up, well, we used to have to go look in the encyclopedia to find out a bit of knowledge, like a fact.
Yeah.
And kids have access to everything all at once. And they have to become these reductive filters, which they decide, well, what do I not want to focus my attention on so that I become this?
Yeah.
Whereas I felt we had to be kind of more additive, like we had to try to build knowledge.
Yeah.
They have to try to filter it away.
Right. Oh, yeah. I mean, not just we, you're right. It's totally flipped. Yeah. But what's interesting, and maybe this is where we can end it and talk about this next time. But as you were saying that, it occurred to me that the way I'm starting to use AI there's one of the ways I'm starting to use it quite a bit is I use Claude, Anthropic's AI. That's kind of my preferred one. But I use it to do that filtering, right? So like if I have a thing that I would have previously Googled that would have like produced a bunch of results that I had to sort of sift through, or produced a bunch, or like, returned a bunch of articles that I now want to read and kind of like process, right? Now I have a conversation with Claude. It does the filtering, right? So I think like it feels like we might be coming back to this time where you don't do any of that filtering so much anymore. The AI does that, as long as it does a good job, right? And then you build again, like so then it's a building process again. So like recently I had just had this, I won't go down this path too far because we should wrap this up, but I had this question in my head, like, what is a nation? Like, and it has to do with the Trump, this conservative and liberal view of like, what, sort of is a nation, is it like a group of, is it defined, what defines it? Like, is it because people who want to like close the border, right? Like what are they protecting? They're protecting the nation. But at the same time, those people can't stand the government, right? So that these kinds of things like are bizarre to me. So I think like how do those people think? Like, what is their definition of a nation? What are they protecting when they want to close the border? What are they hating when they hate the government, right? Like, what is the thing? And so I just had this long conversation with Claude AI, returning all these articles, and you have Rousseau and Hobbes on the the Leviathan versus the two different versions of like what is human nature? Is it bestial, or is it sort of like beautiful collaborative? And that's like, so anyway, just kind of feeding all that into this question of what is a nation has been super interesting. I'm still doing it. It's been like a 3-day conversation with Claude AI. But it's building because it's doing the filtering for me. It's saying, here's how, this person wrote this piece, on this piece of your question or whatever. So it's kind of interesting how AI might be flipping that back to what it was before.
And we can talk about this next time, because that's that question is like, where does AI as a tool fit into our toolbox as humans? Because that's really, I think, the question we need to keep asking ourselves. Like, it's not, we're afraid it will eclipse us and it will become the dominant sort of thought leader on the planet, right? If it's smarter than us. But so far it's another tool,
right.
When we talk about it next time, is that when the photography was invented and all the painters were like, we'll be replaced. And then people started doing really cool stuff in painting that was not realistic because you didn't, a photo was better, right?
Yeah.
And that's sort of, I think, where we're at a similar place where along comes a tool that's scary and disruptive, but at the same time, we need to figure out where it lands in the toolbox. Is it a brush? Is it a camera? Is it what is it exactly?
Mm-hmm.
And how are we going to use it? Cool, man. This is always a delight. And we wanted to end on first world problems, or we
sure, yeah. Why don't we end on a first world problem? Yeah.
You go first. I'm trying to think of all of mine.
Well, the one that I thought of was that. So we have a Chevy Bolt that has a Bluetooth car. It does CarPlay with our phones, right? And both of my phone and my wife's phone are paired with the car. And so if I'm home and she pulls into the garage, like, even though the car's 40 feet away from me or whatever, it immediately hijacks. Like, I'll be watching a video or reading, if it doesn't matter if I'm reading something, but if I'm watching something that has audio, right? Like, the car will pick up this, it will connect then immediately to the car. And so then my wife is hearing whatever thing that I was listening to, and vice versa. Like, if she's on the couch playing a game on her phone and I start the car in the garage, like, I hear her game in the car and she can no longer hear it on the couch, right? Like, so I wish that the Bluetooth in our car had like a 3-foot range, so that if your phone is in the car, that's when it connects. Like, if your phone is outside, more than, but it like will it will steal my bandwidth, my internet connection, my data connection from 30 feet away. If I'm sitting in the living room and the car pulls into the garage, it's so annoying.
That's funny. Mine right now is, because I've been using Mac since 1988, right? I think I got the Classic 2 or something. And so I'm really like, I'm very much a creature of like muscle memory, and I kind of like know all these keystrokes. And so when I reboot or boot up my machine, I have like a series of routines I go through. I have to log into a couple of things. And while it's never felt like a graceful experience, because while I'm typing the password to something, another app opens and like throws itself.
Oh, where it's like it like steals the priority. What do they
steals
call
the
that?
priority?
Focus.
Yeah.
It hijacks your focus. Yeah.
Yeah, like it's every time I reboot, I think, okay, this time I'm going to try to get in the flow and try not to let that happen. And I can't. It's like I wait. I get
when an app launches, it steals your focus on Mac. I don't know why. That's been a Mac thing forever.
Why? Because that's still a thing. Like, it's 2024 and almost we're done, right? And it's still, I literally have to
explain it to another. I'm glad that you talk about it, because it drives me nuts. And I tried to. This is, I think, why it hasn't been solved, because I was ranting about it to somebody else like a year ago, and they were like, "I don't get it," and I kept trying to explain it, and they were like, "Huh? Yeah, I never noticed that." I was like, "Oh, how long have you used a Mac?" "I've always used Macs." "Huh?" And then they were like, "Oh, I guess it does." Then they were like, "I guess it does do that." So I guess, it drives you nuts. It doesn't drive that person nuts, and that's probably why.
Like when I type the password to something, it's not like 1, 2, 3, 4. It's like I do it's sort of like a burst of movement. Yeah. And so while I'm halfway through the burst, a window comes in and it fills half of the password in the wrong place. And you're like, what?
Yeah. You end up sending half your password as a text message to your mom or something.
Like, and who, like, as an end user, who would ever want that? To the programmers, I'd be like, come on, guys. Like
I'm in the middle of something.
You steal half the password and throw it somewhere else, like where I didn't, you would never sit down and be like, how can we make that like actually happen to someone? Like, why?
Yeah, or you're working in an app decides to update and then it relaunches itself and you don't even know that it did that, and you're why am I in this app now?
Yeah. So that's my first world problem, and
I'm 100% with you on that one.
And the second first world problem, I'm just going to say a second one, which is app related. So I use these Adobe Suite, and they went from this model where you buy it once a year or something, and you have like the CDs you load, and then now they update it like twice a day sometimes. And then they've introduced this new cycle that actually Windows or Microsoft used to get blamed for, where they release a beta and they tempt you to use the beta so they can troubleshoot, right?
Yeah, they want you in the beta testing program or whatever. Yeah.
So they make it really easy, and they just say, you click a button that says like, give me the betas. And then I start using the beta because there's a cool feature. And the beta is just this junk app that like I was using it to edit, Premiere beta. And you go to add like a sound, like an AU sort of sound filter, and you click on it. And then instead of seeing a window of options, it's just like a little skinny bar. So you can't pick anything. And so I take a screenshot and I upload it to their thing, and they're like, thanks for reporting the bug, Yeah.
So then that's like, why they want you in the beta, because you're doing that.
But then I have to downgrade myself to the non-beta version. And then it opens and it says, many of the features that you were using no longer work in this. So, you're like, can you make that a little bit more elegant? Like, can you, I don't know. Anyway, so that's my second first world problem. But
all right. Those are good.
Great, man. Awesome.
Right.
And the last thing we need to do, so this is the end. Hey, The last thing we need to do though is we need to just say, I wanted us to just have a conversation where we say satellites. So why satellites? And then I needed to grab like a
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Saying the word satellite, like satellites.
Okay.
Like
Why?
haiku, why haiku?
Yeah. Okay. You want to start it?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So satellites?
Why satellites? Well, a satellite represents a journey, information gathering, this journey around the Earth, that top-down perspective, looking down on us.
High level view, overview, and then there's an orbit quality where, like, if you think of it going around the planet, it's like a daily sort of gathering cycle across a certain path, and we're in two different orbits.
Exactly. Yeah.
Haiku
is the synthesis, is processing all of that information that's gathered. It's that synthesis into something, but not just something, not just anything, but something that has that's engaging, that you want to engage with, that is insightful, that gives you there's that magic of a haiku that gives you some kind of epiphany almost as you read the ending line, that insight, something clicks in your brain.
Right. And the process of writing one requires you to fit a wider scope of thought and language into these 5 syllables, 7 syllables, like into this tiny framework that's clearly designed to force you to be concise.
There's a constraint that forces a certain kind of creativity. Yeah.
Yeah. I like that. Haiku. All right, cool. That's all I needed, because I might be able to mine that for like little pieces that go on top of it. All right, man.
Cool. All right, my brother.
Okay. Take care, man.
Love it. Talk to you later.